Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Carrollton, Texas, October 2nd, 2020. It was a Friday morning. At the apartment complex on the north side of town, residents were already moving cars, grabbing coffee, and heading out for work. At 9 o'clock a.m., sharp, a 24-year-old leasing manager named Alyssa Burkett parked her vehicle in the lot and walked toward the office, where she greeted tenants almost every day. What happened next would unravel into one of the most chilling crime cases Texas had seen in recent memory. Within minutes, neighbors reported the crack of a shotgun. Several people saw Alyssa stumble forward, trying to reach the office entryway. Then came the stabbing, brutal, and deliberate. Calls flooded into 911, dispatchers logging multiple reports of a woman screaming for help. By the time first responders arrived, Alyssa was down and unresponsive, and the lot had transformed into a tightly controlled crime scene. Police procedure in cases like this moves quickly. Officers locked down the area within minutes, cordoning off vehicles and blocking entry to the lot. Emergency medical technicians tried life-saving measures, but the injuries were catastrophic. A single gunshot wound combined with multiple stab wounds left no chance of survival. For investigators, that combination was the first quiet anomaly. A shooter who also carried a knife. That meant planning, not impulse. Alyssa's car was checked. Her purse remained inside, her phone still in place. Nothing had been stolen. The absence of theft was critical because it ruled out a robbery gone wrong. Instead, this was a targeted ambush. Detectives noted her car doors unlocked, the keys still on her. The attacker wanted Alyssa specifically, not her property. Witnesses were separated quickly to prevent crosstalk. Statements taken that morning were striking in their inconsistency. Some described a man in dark clothing. Others thought the attacker had a beard. Still others believed his skin tone didn't look natural, almost as if it had been altered. Inconsistent descriptions are common in high-stress events, but investigators filed them carefully. Later, they would understand why so many witnesses struggled. The attacker had worn a disguise. By 9:15 a.m., patrol units had canvassed nearby buildings, securing surveillance camera angles from the apartment complex and neighboring businesses. Any camera that captured the parking lot was tagged for immediate review. A crime in broad daylight usually leaves a digital trail. But there was another anomaly. The attacker's approach had been rapid, direct, and then gone. Whoever he was, he knew where Alyssa would be and when. From the perspective of law enforcement, time is evidence. The logs from dispatch showed the first 911 call at 9:05 a.m., describing a woman screaming. Another call at 9:06 mentioned gunfire, then someone running. By the time officers rolled in at 9:10, the lot was eerily quiet. No suspect vehicle remained. That compressed timeline suggested the attacker had planned his escape route as carefully as the assault itself. The first forensic markers collected were straightforward: a spent shotgun shell on the pavement, footwear impressions near the office door, and drag patterns consistent with Alyssa's last movements. But investigators also noticed what wasn't there. No sign of a struggle inside the office. No forced entry, no defensive marks on nearby cars or walls. The fight had been short, brutal, and contained to the lot. When an attack is that precise, investigators know they're not dealing with chance. Someone had been waiting. Someone had known Alyssa's routine well enough to strike within minutes of her arrival. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from strangers. It comes from surveillance, planning, or close familiarity. Forensic specialists arrived on scene by late morning. They photographed Alyssa's vehicle, marked evidence on the pavement, and began the chain of custody for every item recovered. The body was transported for autopsy under protocol. Medical examiners would later confirm the combination of a shotgun blast and multiple stab wounds, noting the severity and sequence. The blend of firearms and edged weapon trauma was unusual and would become a central point for prosecutors. Meanwhile, detectives canvassed the neighborhood for any camera footage. Apartment complexes often have limited surveillance, but businesses nearby sometimes capture angles that tenants do not. Every time-stamped video feed from 8:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. was pulled. Investigators expected that even if the disguise fooled witnesses, cameras would help place the suspect vehicle. Another subtle detail stood out that morning. Neighbors familiar with Alyssa told officers she had mentioned concerns about being followed in recent weeks. One coworker recalled her saying she felt watched on her commute. At the time, no one had tied it to imminent danger. In hindsight, those comments would reinforce the theory of premeditation. The first day of any homicide sets the frame for the entire case. Detectives cataloged what they knew. A young mother attacked at work in daylight, a weapon combination suggesting planning, no theft, no random motive, a rapid exit leaving little behind. What they did not yet know was who had orchestrated the ambush, but they were certain of one thing: this was not random violence. The parking lot became the foundation of the case. From that single location, evidence would radiate outward: vehicle traces, disguised remnants, and eventually digital footprints. Each layer would reveal a more elaborate plan than anyone expected. By late morning, Carrollton detectives extended their perimeter beyond the apartment complex. Alyssa's body had already been transported to the medical examiner's office, but investigators knew the attack didn't end at the parking lot. In homicide cases like this, the escape route is just as important as the scene of impact. A witness statement gave them a starting point. Several tenants mentioned seeing a dark SUV leaving the complex immediately after the gunshot. The detail was repeated in multiple 911 calls. Different people, different angles, yet the same consistent description: a black SUV accelerating out of the lot within minutes of the assault. That made the vehicle the next priority. Detectives canvassed nearby intersections and pulled traffic camera footage, searching for that SUV as it merged onto local roads. At 10:30 a.m., one frame from a business security camera showed a vehicle matching the description. Investigators slowed the footage frame by frame. The SUV appeared to have temporary tags, no front license plate visible. That was deliberate concealment. The lack of traceable plates meant whoever planned this attack had thought carefully about how to avoid detection. Inside the SUV, as later searches would confirm, lay the strongest physical evidence of planning. Forensics would recover a shotgun, a knife consistent with Alyssa's stab wounds, and remnants of disguise materials. But in the hours after the murder, the SUV was still only a theory. Detectives had to link it directly to the attack before they could move forward. To do that, they pulled traffic camera timestamps and aligned them with the 911 logs. The SUV was captured less than 3 minutes after the first call, reporting shots fired. That timeline aligned too perfectly. As one investigator later noted, sometimes the data aligning that cleanly is the problem. It means someone knew exactly how fast they needed to move. The FBI's regional office was consulted for video enhancement. Agents confirmed the SUV was most likely a Chevrolet Trailblazer, dark in color, with windows tinted beyond legal limit. That small forensic classification narrowed the search field from thousands of vehicles to hundreds. Vehicle registration databases flagged several in the area. Investigators built a list and began the slow process of elimination. While that technical work unfolded, detectives returned to the apartment complex and expanded their scene analysis. They noticed subtle details on the pavement where the SUV had been parked: a drip of adhesive consistent with wig glue and a latex glove finger torn at the seam. Both were bagged as preliminary evidence. Individually, they might not prove much. But in homicide work, the case is often built from fragments that appear meaningless until they are stacked together. Back at the station, crime scene analysts reconstructed the parking lot with scaled diagrams. The trajectory of the shotgun blast, the direction of Alyssa's movement, the sequence of the stabbing, all of it pointed toward a single fact: the attacker had approached her car on foot, then retreated to a waiting vehicle. There was no prolonged chase, no random drift, just a direct assault, retreat, and escape. By early afternoon, investigators had a new angle: Alyssa's coworkers. They reported seeing the same black SUV in the days leading up to the attack, often idling near the leasing office during early hours. That suggested surveillance. Whoever owned the vehicle had tracked Alyssa's schedule before striking. The SUV thus became more than transportation. It was the moving crime scene, carrying weapons, disguise, and the suspect's route out of Carrollton. When detectives finally executed search warrants days later, the evidence recovered from that vehicle would collapse the defense of coincidence. But on that first day, it was still a puzzle piece waiting to be fit. The chain of investigation was clear. The parking lot provided the assault, and the SUV provided the escape. Both scenes spoke the same language of planning. For the community, the question was terrifying. If someone could stage this kind of attack in daylight, how long had they been preparing? By early afternoon, the Carrollton Police Department shifted focus from the visible crime scenes, the parking lot and the black SUV, To the less obvious but equally critical layer of the investigation, the digital and financial trail. In modern homicide cases, phones, banking activity, and surveillance logs often reveal planning that physical evidence alone cannot confirm. Investigators obtained subpoenas for Alyssa's phone records and began comparing them with tower pings in the hours before her death. Analysts quickly noted that Alyssa's phone activity stopped minutes before the attack. There were no outgoing calls, no texts, no attempted emergency dial. That negative evidence, the complete absence of communication, underscored how fast the assault unfolded. She never had time to reach for her phone. Next, detectives reviewed calls flooding into 911 around the time of the attack. Operators logged multiple distressed callers reporting a single gunshot, followed by screams. The timeline of those reports matched the tower data exactly. For investigators, that alignment confirmed the reliability of both sets of records. Parallel to phone data, detectives pursued Alyssa's financial trail. Bank statements from the previous week showed standard transactions: groceries, gas, daycare costs, nothing irregular. But what stood out was the absence of any cash withdrawals. For a single mother managing tight finances, this meant her day-to-day life left a predictable digital footprint. That predictability would later prove essential when compared to the suspect's movements. In contrast, investigators obtained financial data from potential suspects identified through preliminary leads. One set of transactions revealed unusual activity: large purchases of disguise items and prepaid phones at retail outlets. Those purchases occurred just days before the attack. Linking receipts with surveillance footage, investigators were able to place an unidentified individual buying latex gloves and makeup kits from a chain store. The timestamp fell within a week of Alyssa's murder. Another digital lead emerged from neighborhood security cameras beyond the apartment complex. A camera positioned at a gas station 2 blocks away recorded a black SUV idling for several minutes before the crime. Analysts synchronized the footage with bank card transactions at the same location. A prepaid debit card purchase was logged within that exact time frame. The card was later traced to an account with no verifiable identity, suggesting deliberate effort to hide ownership. At this point, investigators began connecting the dots: prepaid cards, prepaid phones, surveillance of Alyssa's workplace. None of it appeared random. It spoke to methodical planning. Yet there was a subtle tension. As one detective later admitted, the data lined up almost too neatly. And sometimes that's the problem. Real life is messy. When it looks this clean, you know someone tried to control every variable. That observation pushed investigators to be even more cautious in evaluating the evidence, ruling out any possibility of coincidence. The digital evidence also highlighted Alyssa's vulnerability. Court records revealed she had recently been involved in a custody dispute, a process that had placed her in the public eye within her community. It was no secret to people close to her where she worked, when she arrived, and when she left. The combination of financial predictability and public court filings made her movements easier to track. By combining tower records, prepaid card purchases, and surveillance timestamps, investigators began building a geographic chain. It stretched from the gas station to the apartment lot to the escape route captured on traffic cameras. Each point added another layer of confirmation that the crime was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated. In homicide investigations, the question is never only how someone was killed, it's also why this victim at this time. By the fourth day of analysis, investigators had already reconstructed the mechanics of Alyssa Burkhead's final moments outside her workplace in Carrollton, Texas, on October 2, 2020. What remained was to understand who she was, what pressures surrounded her, and whether those pressures revealed a pattern leading toward escalation. Alyssa was 24 years old, a Native American woman, and the mother of a young child. She was known among colleagues as reliable, often juggling work shifts with parenting responsibilities. What placed her at greater exposure, however, was an ongoing custody dispute with the father of her child. Court filings confirm repeated hearings over parental rights. While custody battles are not unusual, the level of acrimony in this case was noted as unusually high. Family court records documented disputes over visitation schedules and child support, providing investigators with both motive context and a paper trail. Forensic victimology requires not just cataloging a victim's lifestyle, but also clarifying which elements made her vulnerable. Alyssa's routine was predictable: arrival at work around the same hour each morning, same parking lot, same entry point. Witness statements indicated she had voiced concerns about being followed in the weeks prior, but no protective order was in place at the time of her death. This detail was critical. It meant law enforcement had no official record of imminent threat, leaving her exposed in an environment where predictability became risk. Financial checks showed Alyssa lived modestly, with no large debts, no unusual spending, and no signs of hidden associations. Digital review of her phone and online accounts produced negative evidence. No recent contacts suggesting threats from strangers, no attempts to purchase protection, no outreach to shelters. Instead, the messages recovered aligned with normal life: childcare arrangements, conversations with friends, and work scheduling. The absence of external risk factors reinforced the working theory that her homicide stemmed from someone within her immediate circle. Interviews with co-workers and neighbors consistently described Alyssa as attentive to her child and cautious in public. What stood out was how frequently she mentioned stress related to the custody battle. Detectives flagged this not as casual conversation, but as an escalation marker. Victimology tied directly into behavioral analysis of the potential suspect pool, narrowing focus to individuals with both access and ongoing disputes. From an investigative standpoint, Alyssa's case demonstrated the collision of ordinary routine and targeted violence. She was not living a high-risk lifestyle. Instead, she was caught in a high-risk relationship dynamic. That distinction became critical when aligning evidence with motive. By the end of this stage, investigators understood the victim not only as a statistic, but as an individual whose life circumstances mapped directly onto the crime scene. Her reliability, predictability, and legal disputes formed a framework that suggested the crime was not random. It was an escalation rooted in control, resentment, and premeditation. The next layer of inquiry would no longer be about the victim's profile, but about how law enforcement built a charging theory, converting scattered evidence and behavioral context into prosecutable proof. By the time investigators finished constructing Alyssa Burkett's victimology profile, the next challenge was clear: taking the evidence, scattered across witness accounts, digital traces, and forensic recovery, and shaping it into a coherent charging theory. For prosecutors, this meant bridging the gap between suspicion and proof, translating investigative fragments into a sequence that could withstand the standards of a courtroom. The initial foundation came from surveillance logs and witness testimony. Multiple bystanders placed a vehicle in the vicinity of Alyssa's workplace just before the attack, a car that matched descriptions tied to her former partner. While this was only preliminary evidence, it allowed detectives to narrow investigative focus without publicly identifying a suspect too early. In cases like this, every step had to balance tactical secrecy with the need to preserve admissibility. Search warrants were executed on digital devices linked to Alyssa's circle. Investigators recovered internet search histories and communication threads that suggested preparation rather than impulse. Forensic analysts logged working evidence of route tracking, device resets, and deletion attempts. Negative evidence was equally important. There was no forced entry at Alyssa's workplace, no signs of robbery, and no indication of a random assailant. Each absence reinforced the theory that her death was premeditated and targeted. Financial records added a deeper layer. Bank activity revealed no unexplained withdrawals by Alyssa, but there were expenditures by individuals close to her involving surveillance equipment and disguises. That trail of receipts, once aligned with cell site data, supported the claim of sustained monitoring. Prosecutors could argue that the crime was not only deliberate but orchestrated over time, dismantling any defense suggesting a spontaneous act of violence. Interagency coordination became critical once the scope of planning was established. Federal forensic labs assisted with digital extractions, while state investigators cross-verified custody court filings to establish motive. Coordinating testimony across these agencies was not just procedural housekeeping, it was strategy. To secure charges, every strand of evidence needed to converge around a consistent narrative: that Alyssa's homicide was the culmination of a custody conflict that escalated into targeted murder. Detectives documented the escalation markers identified earlier and wove them into the prosecutorial theory. A clear timeline, matched to phone activity and financial expenditures, allowed prosecutors to present a chain of intent. This framework elevated the case beyond circumstantial speculation into one that could support indictment on capital charges. Charging theory is the pivot point of any investigation. Here, it transformed Alyssa's case from a violent episode in a parking lot into a demonstrable pattern of surveillance, control, and escalation. The groundwork was laid for the courtroom phase, where the test would no longer be investigative intuition, but the burden of proof under law. The trial unfolded months after Alyssa Burkett's death in a Minnesota courtroom that had become a focal point for her community. By this point, the investigation had assembled a chain of evidence that prosecutors described as meticulous and irrefutable. Jurors were told they would see a case of calculated murder, backed not only by physical traces, but also by deliberate planning that left little room for doubt. Court observers noted how the room carried a restrained intensity. Andrew Beard appeared reserved, dressed formally, but every detail of his demeanor was scrutinized by those in attendance. To one side sat Alyssa's family, prepared to relive the worst hours of their lives as testimony laid bare the events leading to her death. On the prosecution bench, case files and exhibits were stacked in orderly sequence, prepared to reconstruct the timeline step by step. The state's case began with forensic testimony. A crime scene analyst presented photographs documenting shell casings, ballistic comparisons, and the recovery of a knife blade consistent with the stabbing wounds noted in Alyssa's autopsy. The analyst explained how trajectory analysis matched the firearm Beard had been seen possessing weeks before the incident. Preliminary residue tests had been confirmed by laboratory comparison, leaving little ambiguity. Each physical exhibit was introduced methodically. Jurors could follow the chain from Alyssa's workplace parking lot to Beard's movements in the hours after. Digital evidence followed. Investigators outlined Beard's use of surveillance equipment, car trackers, and communication logs. Phone records showed deliberate gaps, negative evidence that, according to specialists, suggested intentional disabling of a device to avoid cell site detection. Yet alternate digital traces surfaced, routing data from his vehicle and testimony from an IT specialist who recovered fragments of deleted search history pointing to methods of disguising identity. These details provided jurors with insight into premeditation. Key witnesses included co-defendant Holly Elkins. Her testimony carried weight not only because of its detail, but because it aligned with physical and electronic records. Elkins admitted to assisting Beard with aspects of planning, confirming what investigators had already pieced together. This was not an act of impulse, but one of calculated intent. While defense counsel attempted to challenge her credibility, cross-examination ultimately reinforced how her statements matched forensic results. The defense strategy focused on undermining the reliability of certain timelines, pointing to potential contamination of forensic samples, and arguing that Elkins was acting to protect herself by shifting blame. They raised questions about the intensity of custody disputes, suggesting Beard was overwhelmed rather than calculating. Yet as testimony accumulated, the weight of material evidence appeared to outweigh the counter-arguments. Jurors were presented not just with theory, but with tangible links, weapon matches, digital reconstructions, and corroborated testimony. Perhaps the most impactful segment of the trial came during victim impact statements. Alyssa's family described her life as a mother, her persistence in securing stability for her daughter, and the abrupt devastation caused by her murder. While such testimony was not evidence, it grounded the jury in the reality behind the charts, exhibits, and procedural language. It reminded the court that beyond the crime scene, Metrics was a woman whose future had been cut short in minutes. The verdict was delivered with clarity. Andrew Beard was convicted on the strength of overwhelming evidence. He later entered a guilty plea that formalized a sentence of 43 years in prison. Holly Elkins, whose role prosecutors described as indispensable to the execution of the plan, received 2 life sentences. The conclusion was unambiguous, leaving no alternate ending or unresolved speculation. For investigators, the trial served as validation that a crime built on layers of premeditation could still be dismantled by careful forensic reconstruction. For the community, it was closure, though not consolation. The procedural chain had reached its endpoint, and with it came a final legal judgment that confirmed what the evidence had shown all along. Once the sentences were handed down, the story of Alyssa Burkett's murder did not close entirely. In the weeks following the trial, investigators and prosecutors began documenting the procedural lessons of the case. Reports highlighted how the timeline had been reconstructed through multiple layers of evidence, ballistics, digital forensics, witness testimony, and how the interagency cooperation between local police, state investigators, and federal digital analysts had ensured no single detail was lost. This became an internal case study in how domestic violence cases with escalating threats can culminate in premeditated homicide if warning signs are overlooked. Forensic teams presented their findings to training divisions. They underlined the importance of what had been classified as negative evidence. The absence of phone activity during key hours, the deliberate disabling of tracking devices, and the lack of forced entry all indicated intentional concealment. These points were later included in seminars for younger investigators, reminding them that in complex crimes, what is missing can carry as much weight as what is found. Community impact was also measured. Advocacy groups pointed to Alyssa's history of custody disputes and the documented stress she had endured. For many in Minnesota, her death underscored the limitations of protective measures when facing a determined offender. Law enforcement briefings emphasize that early intervention protocols must consider patterns of surveillance and stalking behaviors, especially when a suspect has demonstrated willingness to cross legal boundaries. From a procedural standpoint, the case also clarified the value of corroboration. Holly Elkins's testimony could have been dismissed as self-serving, but it was reinforced by physical traces and digital footprints. Prosecutors cited this as a model for handling accomplice testimony, never relying on statements alone, but mapping them against tangible evidence to secure credibility. In internal reviews, it was noted that without Elkins's cooperation, Beard's strategies of concealment might have delayed resolution significantly. The media coverage extended beyond the courtroom. Local stations replayed surveillance timelines, interviews with Alyssa's family, and expert commentary on the growing recognition of coercive control as a precursor to violence. National outlets placed the case within broader discussions about intimate partner violence and its intersection with technology. How tools meant for convenience, such as trackers and shared devices, can be weaponized for control. Law enforcement officials admitted that while the conviction delivered accountability, it did not erase the systemic challenges. Detectives involved in the case later spoke about the difficulty of balancing Alyssa's documented concerns with the evidentiary thresholds required for protective enforcement. That gap between perceived risk and provable threat had left her vulnerable. Procedural bulletins encouraged officers to evaluate not only the immediate incidents, but also the cumulative indicators of escalation. In reviewing the sentencing, legal analysts highlighted the disparity between Beard's 43-year term and Elkins's 2 life sentences. Some argued the outcome reflected plea negotiations. Others that Elkins's direct participation in enabling the attack was viewed as particularly egregious. Regardless, the combination of sentences ensured both principal and accomplice were permanently removed from circumstances where they could re-offend. For Alyssa's daughter, the aftermath was more personal than procedural. Guardianship arrangements were placed under court supervision, and victim advocates ensured continuity of support. These details were less visible in media coverage but central to the long-term consequences of the crime. It was a reminder that while trials end in verdicts, families live with outcomes beyond the courtroom. The case remained in training modules for law enforcement long after the verdict, cited as an example of coordinated investigation and the dangers of underestimating intimate partner threats. Analysts concluded that Alyssa's murder was preventable in theory, but only if early indicators had been translated into decisive action. The lessons, though hard-won, became part of procedural doctrine for similar cases across the state. The courtroom in Denton County carried a weight that had been building since October 2020. Alyssa Burkett's killing was not a mystery by the time the case reached trial. It was a matter of laying bare the extent of planning and malice behind Andrew Beard's actions. Prosecutors brought forward a timeline that showed not only his movements but also the layers of deception he tried to construct. His repeated surveillance of Alyssa's workplace, the premeditated disguise, and the presence of Holly Elkins as a knowing participant turned the case from a crime of passion into a calculated ambush. Witnesses recalled Beard's history of conflict with Alyssa, largely tied to the custody dispute over their young daughter. The evidence left little room for doubt. Cell site records placed him in the area in the moments leading up to the attack. Forensic analysis confirmed the ballistic and knife wounds inflicted in rapid succession, and testimony revealed that Elkins assisted in concealing Beard's preparations and actions. Jurors were confronted with a crime that blended gun violence, a close-range stabbing, and deliberate pursuit, signaling intent at every stage. The defense sought to mitigate, leaning on character references and attempts to frame the attack as a breakdown rather than a plan. But the court could not ignore the volume of digital records and the testimony of accomplice involvement. When Elkins herself faced charges, her role became clearer: support, concealment, and active facilitation of Beard's plan. The legal threshold for conspiracy and complicity was crossed. By the time Beard entered a guilty plea to murder, it was less a strategy than a recognition of inevitable conviction. He was sentenced to 43 years in prison. Holly Elkins received 2 consecutive life sentences for her role, her punishment reflecting both the seriousness of aiding a killing and the societal stance against calculated domestic violence. For Alyssa's family, the courtroom did not offer resolution, but it did provide a measure of acknowledgement. The state formally recognized Alyssa as the victim of a violent and deliberate crime. For her daughter, the judgment meant an end to the years of custody battles, but under the shadow of losing a mother to violence and a father to prison. Cases like this leave lasting marks on communities, especially when they expose the vulnerabilities of women caught in cycles of control and custody disputes. The lesson, repeated by advocates in the aftermath, was that threats in domestic settings should never be underestimated. Warning signs were present. Escalation had been visible. What turned this into a national discussion was the combination of cold preparation and the fact that Alyssa had fought publicly for her rights as a mother, only to become the target of retaliation. The final words of the court did not restore what was lost, but they did establish accountability. Beard would not walk free again for decades. Elkins, facing life terms, would never leave the correctional system. For the record, Alyssa Burkett's cause of death was not in doubt: multiple stab wounds and a fatal gunshot wound in an attack that was both immediate and unrelenting. This was not just another crime story. It was a reminder of the thin line between private disputes and lethal outcomes. And it was proof that in the end, even elaborate planning cannot shield offenders from exposure. Justice, though delayed by the process, was clear and final. Andrew Beard incarcerated with a 43-year sentence. Accomplice Holly Elkins serving 2 life terms. Case closed. This crime stands as both a conviction and a warning. When I look back at Alyssa's story, I cannot help but see more than just a crime. It's a warning and a lesson for every family in America. Domestic disputes do not stay behind closed doors. Sometimes they escalate into irreversible tragedy. Alyssa fought for her child's future, but her life was taken by the very person she once trusted. The message is clear. We need to recognize danger early, speak up, and protect those who are at risk. I share this not just as a narrator, but as someone reminding you that justice, though served, can never bring Alyssa back. What it can do is force us to ask harder questions. How do we handle custody battles without endangering lives? How do we support victims before violence takes over? I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think communities can do better to prevent cases like this? Please share your thoughts in the comments and let me know where you're watching from. If this story touched you, even if it was difficult to hear, subscribe to the channel so we can continue uncovering these true crime cases together. Your engagement keeps these conversations alive, and your voice matters. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. And if you didn't like this video, tell me why. I want to learn from you too.